They betrayed me. My parents gave everything to my siblings in their will and left me nothing. I was told bluntly, everything stays with your sister. You don't deserve anything. That was the moment I decided, enough. No more paying their bills, no more sacrifices. It was time to live for myself. But barely a month had passed when my mother appeared at my doorstep, tears streaming down her face. "Help me, my daughter, I beg you." When I uncovered the truth that my parents had secchatretly signed over every last bit of their property to my younger sister, Sarah, it felt like the foundation of my entire life had suddenly cracked beneath me. I had never once fixated on inheritance. Wealth from parents? That was never the goal. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. The most important thing is to be a decent person, not to expect riches from anyone. But this wasn't about money. It was about something far deeper. When I realized that my parents had effectively erased me from their future, I felt something raw and ugly rise inside me. Shock, confusion, despair. Had I been nothing more than a placeholder? A backup, useful only for chores and obligations? The revelation came by accident. Our great-aunt Nicole, strict, always impeccably dressed, with thin glasses perched on her nose, had worked as a notary's secretary all her life. One evening, she called me, her voice hesitant, almost a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. "Mary, did you know your parents updated their will? I think everything is in Sarah's name. I came across the papers while archiving." My heart plummeted. "Are you sure?" I asked, my throat dry. "I saw it with my own eyes," she admitted. "I normally don't interfere in such matters, but your parents should have told you themselves." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in silence, phone still pressed to my ear as my mind spiraled through the years. Hadn't I always noticed the difference? Hadn't I always felt it? Sarah was the fragile one, the delicate flower needing extra care. "She's sickly. She eats poorly. Be gentle with her," my mother used to say. To me, "You're big enough to manage on your own." It became ingrained in me, independence, self-sufficiency. While Sarah was shielded, spared, forgiven, I was the one expected to be strong, to give way, to handle things. And even in adulthood, nothing changed. Sarah needed help. First to get into university, then to rent her apartment, then to build her career in Moscow. My parents would gush about her to anyone who'd listen. "Our Sarah, such a beauty. Working in Moscow, making a name for herself. She rarely visits, but she's reaching new heights." And me? "Mary is reliable, practical. She knows how to take care of herself." That was all. No admiration, no celebration. I was the dependable one, the one who needed nothing. I never resented her for it. Not fully. My parents were good people in many ways. I loved them. But their words stung. Every time I came home, taking my mother to her doctor's appointments, helping my father in the garden, I'd hear it again. "You do well, of course, but Sarah, she's traveling abroad now. Soon she'll move to another department, triple her salary. And you, still in that small office?" As if my quiet, stable life was something to be pitied. As if I should be competing with a sister who never had to fight for a thing. And then that call from Aunt. That will. That final, undeniable confirmation that in their eyes, she mattered more. I had to confront them. I took the day off work, boarded the bus, and made the trip. Usually, my visits were met with warmth. Dad setting aside his newspaper, Mom ushering me to the table, tea already steeping. Not this time. I didn't even set down my bag before I said it. "I know about the will. Everything is going to Sarah. Is that true?" Mom, sorting through some papers, didn't even flinch. Yes. What's the big deal? We decided long ago. You're fine. Everything is stable for you. But Sarah, Moscow is harder. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. So, the apartment, the summer house, everything is hers, and me? Mom sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. Don't be upset. We love you. But this is what we've decided. If things don't work out with her fiancé, she'll need somewhere to return to. And she's still paying her mortgage. Something inside me snapped. Years of silent hurt clawed their way to the surface. Why do you assume her life matters more than mine? That her struggles are greater? Her needs more important? Do I not deserve the same security? Mom rolled her eyes. Mary, it's just a formality. We're still alive. And it's easier for you. You don't have those burdens. You've got your life sorted. I felt a sharp, burning anger. She didn't even realize. Didn't see how much her words cut. So that's it then? You've written me off. I'm always supposed to handle things alone, and Sarah... Enough, she snapped. No need for drama. Your father will explain when he wakes up, and stop raising your voice. I exhaled, slow and deliberate. When I spoke again, my voice was ice. Fine, but don't expect another cent from me. No more bills, no more doctor visits, no more running to help whenever you call. Mom paled. But those are our expenses. Your father is weak, and Sarah can't come down every weekend. You're just going to abandon us? I didn't answer. I just grabbed my coat and stepped into the hallway. Behind me, Mom's voice rose in panicked protests, but I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was on the bus, staring out at the blurred landscape, that I realized I hadn't seen Dad at all. Had he been asleep the whole time? Or had he simply chosen to stay in the back room, silent, as his daughter was cast aside? All the way back, I stood under the shower, my body shaking, but no tears came. It was as if something inside me had burned to ashes. At work, numbers and reports blurred together, my concentration slipping through my fingers like sand. Evenings felt hollow. I drifted from room to room, restless, tormented by a single question. Why? Why had they done this to me? Two voices battled within me. One whispered, "They're still your parents. You love them. Don't abandon them." The other, louder, more insistent, roared, "They betrayed you. They've cast you aside your whole life." In the end, I listened to the second voice. I silenced my conscience and its pleas to call, to check in, to help. No, let Sarah handle it. Let her take responsibility for once. I had my own life to live. For the first time, I allowed myself to put my own needs first. No more weekend trips. No more paying their bills. Let's see how quickly Sarah would step up. Weeks passed. I ignored my mother's calls. Each time her name flashed on the screen, I let it ring. Then, one night, the office landline rang. Thinking it was a client, I picked up, only to hear my mother's anxious voice. "Mary, where have you been? Your father is unwell. His blood pressure is through the roof, over 200. Don't you care?" I kept my voice low, not wanting my colleagues to overhear. "I do care, but you said yourself, I can handle things while Sarah has it harder. Turn to her." "She can't. She has an important project at work. They won't let her leave. We've been waiting for a week just to hear if she can send any money." I inhaled sharply. "Well, since she's your chosen heir, she'll figure it out. Goodbye." I hung up, feeling eyes on me from across the office. Some of my coworkers probably thought I was a heartless daughter, but I was drowning in years of pent-up resentment. The next day, my phone rang again. This time, Sarah. "Are you out of your mind?" she yelled the moment I answered. Mom and Dad are freaking out. Dad's sick. Mom's desperate. Why are you ignoring them? I stayed calm. Funny how concerned you are now that it's inconvenient for you. Where was this concern when they wrote me out of their lives? She sighed, exasperated. I didn't ask for the apartment. They made that decision. If it's about money, I'll send you some, but don't abandon them. I clenched my jaw. If you knew it was unfair, why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you tell them to reconsider? Silence. Then a click. She hung up. Was she angry? Guilty? I didn't know. And at that moment, I didn't care. For the first time in years, I lived for myself. I picked up hobbies, went to the gym, lost myself in books and movies. And when guilt crept in, when a nagging thought reminded me that Dad might need me, I shut it down. They made their choices. Now, they had to live with them. Then, a message changed everything. Mary, sorry to bother you, but your father was taken to the hospital. Hypertensive crisis. They found heart complications. Your mother is frantic. She doesn't have money. I thought you should know. The sender was a neighbor. My breath caught. So, it was real. He really was sick. And Mom? She hadn't told me sooner. I dialed her number. She answered, sobbing. Mary, I didn't know how to reach you. It was just in time, the doctors said. He could have had a heart attack. We don't have enough for his treatment. Sarah hasn't sent anything yet. Please, I'm begging you, help us. Come talk to the doctors. I gripped the phone, torn between pity and frustration. Why did they always call me when things got desperate? When it was too late? The next morning, I left without a word to my co-workers. At the hospital, my father lay weak, hooked up to an IV. When he saw me, he struggled to sit up. I stepped closer. Are you okay? His lips trembled. I'm sorry. Whatever anger I had left dissolved in that moment. Looking at him, frail, vulnerable, I couldn't bring myself to stay bitter. I exhaled. Just get better, okay? They got you here in time. Mom appeared in the doorway and, the moment she saw me, broke down. Mary, please don't leave us again. We need you. We'll explain everything. I nodded but said nothing. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I stayed. For the next 24 hours, I arranged medications, spoke to doctors, took care of paperwork. Sarah called once. What's going on with Dad? She asked, her tone rushed. Still in the hospital. Needs more tests. I can't come right now. There are audits at work. I clenched my teeth. Then at least send some money. You're getting their inheritance, aren't you? She hesitated. I already transferred some to Mom. Check the account. Later, Mom scoffed. It's barely enough for a prescription. That stoked the fire in my chest. I wanted to leave. I had done enough. But then the doctors insisted that Dad needed more tests. Mom clung to me, desperate. Mary, I don't know anyone here. I'm scared of talking to the doctors alone. If something happens... I sighed. Sarah can't come? She has work. Yeah, of course. I called my boss and took emergency leave, and so my reluctant vigil at the hospital began. I didn't know what scared me more, watching my father's health decline or realizing how deeply I still cared despite everything. The doctors spoke of age, pressure, heart complications. I listened, asked questions, made decisions. And, for the first time in years, my parents relied on me fully. But I couldn't ignore the bitter truth. They had chosen their heir, and she had chosen not to show up. My mother drifted through the house like a ghost in those days, avoiding my gaze as if fearing a verdict. I could sense the words caught in her throat, the hesitant glances, the aborted attempts at conversation. Maybe guilt gnawed at her, whispering that she had erased me from her thoughts when drafting the will. Maybe shame kept her silent. And then, just once, when I handed her a cup of tea, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. Maybe we went too far, leaving everything to Sarah. She didn't mind. We thought you were always strong, that you didn't need anything. Forgive us if we hurt you. The words felt hollow. I swallowed hard, unwilling to grant her the relief of absolution. This isn't the time to talk about it, I muttered and left the room. A week later, my father was discharged from the hospital. A long list of medications, dietary restrictions, and one piece of impossible advice: avoid stress. But how do you erase stress when your mother weeps over unpaid bills, your sister hides behind excuses about delayed salaries and suffocating mortgages? I stayed at my parents' house, even as it drained me. Their quiet expectation, Mary will handle it, Mary always does, felt like a noose tightening. And of course, once again, the burden was mine alone. One evening, as frustration clawed at my ribs, I reached for my coat, ready to escape. But my mother stopped me with a quiet plea. "Come to the kitchen with me." Under the hum of the refrigerator, she hesitated, then spoke. "I see now how unfair it was. Maybe we should rewrite the will. Daddy and I will speak to a notary. Just don't leave us." Her words sliced through me, not with joy, no. It was bitterness that welled up, raw and unhealed. It had taken my father's illness for them to see me, to see what I had given, what had been taken for granted. "Do as you wish," I forced out, "but wounds like this don't heal overnight." She wept harder. "I'm sorry, Mary. We thought Sarah was alone in the capital, struggling. And you never thought that I might struggle too?" She nodded slowly. Yes. That single word was heavier than I expected. The next morning, I found my parents deep in discussion. My father, who had remained silent, finally admitted the mistake. He looked at me, truly looked at me, as though seeing me for the first time. He knew now I had given my time, my money, my life, while Sarah breezed in on holidays like a guest. Soon, they told me they'd arrange for the will to be changed. Everything would be split evenly. But was it too late? Still, resentment was a prison, and perhaps this was the key. I decided to return to my own home, to my own life. My mother begged me to stay. My father, still weak, echoed her plea. "You won't leave us, will you?" "I have a life," I said. "I have work. I can't be here all the time." "Your sister is coming," I added, watching for their reaction. Maybe now she understands she has responsibilities too. They nodded, acknowledging, finally, that I wasn't the only one who should carry the weight. Sarah called after hearing about the will. Her voice was uncertain, laced with forced remorse. "I never meant to exclude you. It was Mom and Dad's decision." "Maybe so," I cut in, "but if you hadn't accepted it, they would have thought differently. You understand now, don't you? We both have to help, not just me." She hesitated, then admitted, "I'll come for a few days, take over for you. We'll see actions, not words." Weeks passed. My mother sent me a picture of the new will. Official, notarized, equally divided. Justice, at last. Yet the scars inside me still ached. When I visited again, something was different. My mother fussed over my favorite cabbage pies. My father asked about my work for the first time in years. Before, he never cared to understand my reports, my deadlines. Now, he listened. I almost felt like I had stepped into an alternate reality, one where my parents saw me. Still, the shadow of old wounds lingered. "I won't be paying for everything on my own anymore," I said firmly. My mother nodded quickly. Of course, Sarah will contribute, and we'll try too. A few days later, Sarah arrived. We passed each other in the hallway. Her visit, a rare event, used to be once every 6 months at best. Maybe guilt had finally reached her. I met her gaze and said, "Your turn to take care of Dad now. I hope you won't vanish again." She flinched, then nodded. "I know. I'll try to make it up to you." We didn't hug, but for the first time, I felt the ice cracking between us. Back in my own life, I still felt broken. The weight of years of resentment doesn't lift easily. I started seeing a psychologist, unpacking the damage, how I had been cast as the strong one while all resources flowed to the weak child. Maybe my mother had never realized she was hurting me. Maybe she had simply believed I was unbreakable, but I had broken. And now I was healing. A month later, a message from my mother lit up my screen. "Sarah stayed for 2 weeks, helped your father in the hospital, brought us food. Maybe things are truly changing." I read it twice, a cautious relief creeping in. Perhaps my sister had finally understood that love isn't just about being cherished, it's about showing up. We gathered for my father's birthday, all of us, me, Sarah, my parents, even Aunt Nicole. These celebrations used to sting. I would cook, clean, carry the weight while my parents sighed about how, if only Sarah had been here. But this time, we were all present. Over dinner, my mother suddenly said, "Daughters, I want to apologize. Your father and I were unfair. We thought Mary was strong and didn't need us, while we protected Sarah. That was a mistake, one that caused pain." The room went quiet. For the first time, they had spoken the truth. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. "You see, we want you both to have confidence in us." My sister nodded, and I nodded too, feeling something inside me soften. Just a little. I wanted to say, "Too late," with cold detachment, but I knew that hoarding resentment was like swallowing poison and expecting someone else to suffer. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "Okay, let's call it a mutual fresh start. But I'm not carrying the whole load anymore. If you need help, reach out to Sarah too. And sometimes, try to solve things yourselves." Dad placed a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Daughter, we understand. We're getting older, and sometimes we don't realize how our decisions look from the outside." His words reached something deep inside me. Perhaps, for the first time, my parents truly saw me, not just as the strong one, but as their daughter, a person with needs and emotions, just like my sister. Maybe they were finally learning that raising one child to be self-sufficient and another to be protected was a mistake that left scars. That night, we spoke about how we'd spend time together once Dad felt better. Someone suggested a family trip to the lake. As they talked, I caught my sister glancing at me, hesitant, almost guilty. Later, while we washed the dishes, she turned to me. "Mary, I really don't want there to be any hard feelings between us anymore. I used to think that if Mom and Dad decided something, it must be right. But now I realize I should have spoken up sooner. I should have said the will should be split from the beginning. I'm sorry." I sighed, drying a plate in silence. Finally, I replied, "I won't pretend I can forget it overnight. But thanks for the apology." A small, tentative smile passed between us, strained but real. After that, we found a new rhythm. My sister contributed financially when she could, and I helped with practical things, but not at the expense of my own well-being. I learned to say, "I can't come today, you'll have to handle it yourselves." And, to my surprise, my parents managed. When their fence needed repairs, they found a neighbor to do it. Before, they would have called me, "You're good at arranging things?" But now, they figured it out on their own. Dad's health slowly improved. He wasn't thriving, but he wasn't on the brink anymore. On my visits, we reminisced about childhood stories. One day, he mentioned my old bicycle, the one I used to race around the yard. "Maybe you should take it and restore it," he offered. I laughed. "I have enough ways to get around, Dad." But inside, warmth spread through me. For the first time, he was acknowledging my past, not just praising my old habits now and then. Once, she casually mentioned, "Sarah's boss paid for her trip to Europe. And you, Mary, you never seem to want to travel?" I braced myself for irritation, but then she quickly added, "Oh, sorry." I didn't mean to compare. She caught herself. That was new. I only smiled. The comparisons were losing their power. Sarah, after staying with our parents for 2 weeks, went back to the city, promising to visit more often. And she did. One day, she even texted me, "Hey, I'll be at Mom and Dad's. Maybe we can do something together?" That was unheard of. We ended up going out to a cafe with Mom, just the 3 of us. We laughed, sipped coffee, shared casual stories. For once, it wasn't a tense family gathering or a forced holiday dinner. It was something normal. Looking at Mom's face, I saw a quiet relief, like she was grateful we weren't at each other's throats. Maybe she regretted how things had been. Maybe she wished she had done better sooner. But at least now, she was trying. The betrayal still left scars, but they weren't as raw anymore. My parents had made mistakes, big ones. But they had admitted them, rewritten the will, and taken steps to change. I had a choice: stay trapped in bitterness or accept that people, even parents, can grow. Yet doubt still nagged at me. What if this newfound fairness was just a moment of vulnerability? What if, once Dad fully recovered, they'd slip back into old patterns? What if I became the strong one again and Sarah the fragile one? I voiced these fears to my psychologist. What if they're just saying what I want to hear to keep me around? Then test them, he suggested. Set boundaries. Say no when you need to. See how they react. So I did. One day, Mom called. "Mary, can you cover our utility bills this month? Your sister doesn't have time to handle it." I exhaled calmly. "I can't, Mom. I have my own expenses. Dad has a pension, right? You'll figure it out." There was silence. A year ago, she would have sighed dramatically, called me ungrateful. But this time? The next day, she found a way. They weren't perfect, but they were learning. As months passed, my parents found a new rhythm. Dad tended to the front garden. Mom became more independent. Sarah visited every couple of months. I came about once a month, and when I did, I was welcomed. Not as a default caretaker, but as their daughter. Mom would bake a cake. Dad would save little things to show me. They didn't dump their problems on me anymore. We simply talked. It was strange, almost foreign, but it felt right. Like we were finally becoming a real family instead of playing roles we had been assigned long ago. It had been 6 months since everything changed. I no longer felt trapped in the role of the responsible one. Now I had choices. If I wanted to visit, I did. If I didn't, I didn't. One night, as I sat in the kitchen with Mom after dinner, something struck me. My father was asleep. My sister was back in her city. It was just the 2 of us. A year ago, this moment would have been laced with tension. But now it was simply quiet, peaceful. Mom stirred her tea, then looked up at me. "You know, Mary, I never meant for things to be so unfair between you and your sister. We made mistakes. But I see it now. I really do. For once, I believed her. Maybe things weren't perfect. Maybe they never would be. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the afterthought of my family. And that was enough. My mom pulled out an old, time-worn box, its corners softened by years of use, and lifted the lid as if unlocking a forgotten chapter of our past. Inside, scattered photo cards told silent stories of our childhood. One in particular caught my eye, a snapshot of little Sarah, her hair adorned with oversized bows, standing in the spotlight of my mother's attention. Beside her, a couple of years older, I stood frowning, as if already aware of my place in the background. My mother leaned over my sister, adjusting something for her, an unspoken metaphor for the way things had always been. She ran her fingers gently over the image and sighed. You know, I always saw so much of myself in you. You were strong, determined, like you could handle anything. And Sarah, she always seemed fragile, like she needed extra care. Maybe that's where I went wrong. I thought you didn't need a safety net. I swallowed hard, the weight of years pressing down on me. Mom, I just wanted you to ask me, just once, how I was feeling. If I needed help. Not money, not things, just support. But it was always Sarah in the center of your world. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't brush them away like an inconvenience. I'm sorry. I see it now. You can't split your children like that. I just hope, someday, you'll truly forgive me. I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. It's in the past. I don't want to carry this resentment forever. We sat in silence, the air thick with words left unsaid over the years. But in her tired eyes, I saw something I hadn't before. Gratitude, maybe even understanding. For the first time, we weren't just a mother and daughter weighed down by old wounds. We were two people trying to mend what had been broken. Little by little, things changed. My parents started recognizing that they had placed an unfair burden on me, expecting too much without ever asking if I was okay. Am I completely happy now? Not entirely. But I've learned. I don't rush in to solve every minor inconvenience. When they call about a leaky faucet or an internet bill, I simply say, I'm busy, figure it out, or call Sarah. And, shockingly, they do. When it's something serious, I help, without feeling like I'm being drained dry. And that, I realized, is the balance I had been missing all along. Looking at our family now, the change is undeniable. My parents no longer see me as an inexhaustible pillar of strength, and my sister, once the helpless, pampered favorite, now actively takes responsibility. The inheritance? Fairly divided now, eliminating those bitter pangs of exclusion that once gnawed at me. But the biggest shift? They stopped assuming I'd always be there, no matter how they treated me. It turns out, standing my ground, refusing to be their financial crutch, was what truly forced them to listen. Some might say my parents repented out of necessity, that guilt and circumstance, not love, drove them to change. Maybe. But in life, people often only see their mistakes when they're faced with losing something precious. The important thing is, we're no longer strangers to each other. And that means something. Sometimes I wonder, if Dad hadn't fallen ill, would things have ever changed? Would they have expected me to keep swallowing my feelings until there was nothing left of me? Maybe. But life took its course, shaking us all awake, forcing us to look at things we had ignored for years. My relationship with Sarah isn't perfect, but it's evolving. She tells me about her career, asks for advice, even steps up for our parents without waiting for me to do it first. The jealousy I used to feel, the resentment at her privileged place in our family, has faded. Because I now understand that love isn't about who gets more, and I refuse to measure my worth by the scraps of attention I receive. And the best part? I no longer hesitate to say, "Sarah, Mom needs medicine. Can you get it?" I don't feel guilty for asking, and she doesn't hesitate to say yes. Of course she has her own struggles, but that's the thing. We all do. The difference is, now we don't expect one person to bear them alone. Living through this experience unearthed years of buried injustice, years of feeling unseen. Did I emerge unscathed? Some wounds never fully heal. I still remember, with painful clarity, the day my mother declared that everything would go to my sister. But those wounds don't bleed anymore. They have scarred over, serving as a reminder that I have a right to my own life, my own choices, and my parents, they know that now too. No more backhanded comments about inheritance being not my concern. Instead, my mother sighs and says, "Let's hope we live a long time, but if anything happens, everything will be split equally." She says it not to appease me, not as an obligation, but as an acknowledgement of fairness. And that matters. Not because I want anything from them, but because I finally feel valued. Dad, too, has softened. He calls to ask how I'm doing, if I'm taking time for myself. He never used to. He assumed I was fine, unbreakable. Now, he sees me as a person, not just a soldier marching forward without question. Even Mom has changed in subtle ways. She still complains that Sarah doesn't call enough, but I no longer jump to fix it. I just shrug and say, she'll call when she can. And surprisingly, Mom lets it go. She's adjusting to the new rules of the game. This journey taught me something invaluable. Never store up resentment like a ticking time bomb. Sometimes walking away, saying, "I'm done, figure it out yourselves," shakes up the world more than years of silent endurance. And just as importantly, always leave room for reconciliation if the other person is willing to meet you halfway. I used to fear that if I stopped sacrificing myself, my parents would cut me off. In reality, it brought us closer. We had to confront our dysfunction, and through that we found something new: mutual respect. Now, when I see my sister's social media posts, her glamorous business trips, her picture-perfect life, I no longer feel that sting of comparison. We have different paths, different definitions of success. I have a quiet job, a modest home, and no desperate climb up the career ladder. And that's okay. I haven't lost to her. I've simply chosen my own race. And my parents? They no longer pity me for it. Recently, the three of us, Mom, Dad, and I, took an evening stroll along the waterfront. They walked this path countless times before, but for me, it felt new. For the first time, I wasn't weighed down by old grievances. As Mom reminisced about the past, how Dad worked at the factory, how we were once a happy family, I didn't feel the usual bitterness creeping in. I simply listened. And for once, I laughed. At the end of our walk, my father turned to me with a quiet, almost hesitant request. "Daughter, let's do this again sometime. You don't visit as often now, but we love having you around, especially when you're in good spirits." I smiled, feeling the warmth of his words settle in my chest. "Of course, Dad. I'll come, but not every week like before. I'll visit when I can." No one objected. No accusations of being ungrateful. Just an understanding nod, as if we had finally reached a place of mutual respect. That moment solidified something for me. We had entered a new phase of our relationship, one where I was no longer obligated to bear the weight of the family alone. Looking back, I feel relief. The hardest months, the ones where I abruptly stopped helping and wrestled with the guilt, are behind me. But I don't regret what I did. If I hadn't made that stand, nothing would have changed. My sister would still assume I was happy being the helper daughter. My parents would still believe I had no need for their attention. Yes, my father's illness was a wake-up call, a painful one. But sometimes it takes a crisis to force people to step into another's shoes and truly see the damage they've caused. And now that my parents have not only admitted their mistakes, but are actively trying to make me feel like a valued daughter, I know I did the right thing by forcing them to face the truth. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I recall that brutal day when my mother practically shouted in my face, "You don't deserve it! Everything will go to your sister! She needs it more!" And the way my resolve hardened right then and there. No more money, no more endless sacrifices. It had sounded cold, even cruel at the time, but that breaking point was what ultimately forced a shift in our family dynamic. A month later, my mother was at my doorstep, tears in her eyes pleading, "Help us, my daughter." I don't believe in revenge. I never wanted to play the game of now I hold the power. But there is something undeniably significant in realizing that taking a step back, drawing a firm boundary, was what it took for them to finally see me, to treat me as more than just the reliable one. And so, we move forward. My father is slowly recovering. My sister juggles her metropolitan career with more frequent visits home. I've mastered the ability to say no without feeling like a traitor. The will sits untouched in a drawer, now fair and equal. Not that it defines my sense of worth anymore. Most importantly, we are learning, truly learning, to talk without the unspoken rule that Sarah needs support and you're strong enough to manage on your own. Perhaps to an outsider, this might seem like a belated reconciliation, too little too late. Perhaps some would judge my parents for taking so long to change, but I don't care about outside opinions. What matters is that I can now visit them, sit down for tea, share my feelings, and finally receive support instead of expectations. This could have been a story with a tragic ending. If I had kept silent, if I had continued to shoulder everything alone, we might have remained locked in that same destructive pattern forever. But I took a desperate step, and it changed everything. Parents don't always realize their mistakes until they are forced to feel the weight of their injustice. And sometimes, the only way to make them understand is to walk away, to show them what it feels like to lose the child they took for granted. Let this be a testament to that truth. Family bonds can be rebuilt, but only if all parties are willing to acknowledge their faults and change. As for me, I have reclaimed something invaluable: the right to live without constantly fearing I will be used up and cast aside because the other daughter needs more care. And that, more than anything, is a profound relief.